thank you everyone for coming in the room and online. I'm Nobbs-Thiessen. I'm a co-director for the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies, and you're all here at our 9th annual CTMS Lecture. Here on the 500th anniversary of Anabaptism, we are turning our attention to all things early Anabaptism, and we have a talk tonight by Dr. Karl Koop, which is entitled When the Dutch Got Worldly, The Origins of an Anabaptist Global Imagination. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered here in Winnipeg, where we live and work on Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and the Shinnu, Assiniboine, Cree, Dakota First Nations, and the heartland of the Red River Métis. We drink our water sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, and we continue to reflect as those interested in Mennonite history on the relationships between Mennonites and settler colonialism and a responsibility to pursue reconciliation with Indigenous communities. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Aileen Friesen and Jeremy Wiebe in the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies for their assistance in organizing this event, and acknowledge that these lectures would not be possible without the generous support of the D.F. Plett Historical Research Foundation, as well as a generous donation nearly half a century old from the David and Catherine Friesen family that kicked off the Mennonite Studies program here at UWinnipeg, I think back in 1978. So our 9th annual CTMS lecture, as I said, is going to be delivered by Dr. Karl Koop. Karl, who I've got to know over the past few years as a colleague over at CMU, teaches in the areas of history and theology and is co-editor of Vision, a journal for church and theology. He's taught previously at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary and was on Mennonite Central Committee assignment in Brandenburg and Berlin in the mid-1990s. He received his PhD from St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, and also has degrees from Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, the University of Manitoba, and Canadian Mennonite Bible College. His books and articles in the past 25 years have been in the field of Anabaptist and Mennonite studies. In his working career, Karl was initially involved in the family farm in the Niagara Peninsula, and with a focus on poultry and wine production. His parents were immigrants from the former Soviet Union who came to Canada in the 1920s. Karl still likes the idea of working with poultry and wine production, but is content with gardening in his backyard or with his daughters somewhere in Winnipeg or outside of Morden, Manitoba. He's married to Kathy Koop, who lived in Germany for the first 22 years of her life. They have 4 married daughters, one of them, Heidi, is also in attendance, and 5 grandchildren. So I'm going to let Karl come up and take the floor. I'll just say there's going to be a Q&A after the talk. So think of questions as you're listening to Karl speak, and then we're going to move through the doors over there for an informal reception afterwards. So let's welcome Karl to the floor. All right, thank you.
I don't think I can talk as fast as Ben, so thank you for the invitation to participate in this annual lecture series. It's an honor to be here. And thank all of you for coming this evening. You could be watching a hockey game. This is quite amazing. So anyway, it's good to be here. This year, communities around the world are commemorating Anabaptism's 500 years. There's much to ponder in this anniversary year, given the evolving character of the tradition and its global reach. The Anabaptist movement began in Europe, but through migration, mission work, and efforts in local communities, Anabaptism has now also found its place in North America and around the world. After 500 years, over 2 million Anabaptists can be found in 86 countries, with an estimated 2/3 living in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In recent decades, the attention to this global reality has taken on various forms. For example, through persistent efforts, Mennonite World Conference, which is also recognizing its centennial anniversary this year, has been bringing Anabaptist communities from different regions of the world together for fellowship, for mutual support and common service. Scholars have also participated in this global vision. In 1997, Mennonite World Conference initiated the Global Mennonite History series that led to the publication of 5 volumes of Mennonite history, one for each continental region where Mennonites are represented. Royden Lowen, who is connected here to the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies, co-authored the North American volume together with Stephen Nolt. Additional examples of projects promoting global awareness have included efforts to maintain the Global Anabaptist Mennonite Encyclopedia online. Here at the University of Winnipeg, the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies has done its part in raising awareness of Anabaptism's global reality. According to its mission statement, the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies is a research center at the University of Winnipeg that approaches the history and culture of Mennonites within a transnational context. It recognizes that Mennonites are a global people, historically engaging as settlers in international migrations, multinational residences, international social services, and foreign missions amidst a strengthening dialogue between communities of the global North and South. CTMS seeks to enhance teaching, research, knowledge, mobilization, and community outreach by employing a transnational framework. In this mission statement, there is an awareness of Anabaptism's global reach, and there is also a mindfulness regarding a particular methodology or methodological approach to how one thinks about this global reality. The attentiveness to Anabaptism's transnationalism at Mennonite World Conference, maybe at local church communities, maybe at academic centers or academic settings, this attentiveness raises questions about origins. Where did this transnational imagination come from? When did it first become prominent? We might consider the first or second generation Anabaptists, but the scholarship tells us that the first decades of the movement tended to be fragmented and not very well defined. While interregional correspondences and conferences between Northern and Southern Anabaptists in Europe did take place from time to time, a sense of a common peoplehood was still many years away. The story of origins might be found in the North American context. Stephen Nolt has pointed out that a global consciousness was linked to the historic tendency among Anabaptist groups to think of themselves as being separate from the world, a world in conflict. As Nolt observes, during the mid-20th century, Mennonite efforts to distinguish themselves from prevailing Cold War sentiments resulted in Mennonites engaging in service work overseas. These experiences encouraged a shift in self-perception toward global citizenship. By the 1980s, about 14% of Mennonites in North America had completed a long-term overseas service assignment. International service, it seems, had become a Mennonite rite of passage. And ironically and unexpectedly, the commitment to separatism became the impetus for a growing global consciousness. If this is so, it stands to reason that a heightened awareness of Anabaptism around the world would have emerged at this time or at that time, especially as the Anabaptist demographic center was also shifting from north to south. And yet, if the question of origins interests us, I am more inclined to look further back to the 17th and 18th centuries, a time when Dutch Mennonites got worldly. It is here, I wish to argue, that we begin to see the beginnings of transnationalism, what I have named in the title of this lecture, The Origins of a Global Imagination. This may seem like an odd thesis, at least in the way that I have framed it, but it is not entirely new. Mennonite historians such as Astrid van Slachter and Troy Osborne have written about a developing trans-territorial or transnational consciousness among European Mennonites in the 17th and 18th centuries. And a host of other scholars have provided significant material giving support to this thesis. For example, James Lowry, together with scholars in Europe and North America, has brought to light a wealth of information from the Amsterdam archives that has now recently been gathered into 3 volumes entitled Documents of Brotherly Love. The final volume in the series, Volume 3, was published in 2023. Together, these works in translation cover the correspondences and extraordinary active service of Dutch Mennonites from 1645 to 1784, and point to the development of transnational relationships among Anabaptists in the Netherlands, South Germany, Switzerland, and North America, and beyond. Much of this material has yet to be carefully analyzed, especially the 3rd volume. This is simply to say that what I am talking about this evening stands on the shoulders of others. Nevertheless, I do hope to provide a particular perspective and detail to the presentation this evening. I'm interested in memory studies, and in a year when Anabaptist communities around the world are thinking about the past 500 years, I'm wanting us, among other things, to think about what it is that we remember and what it is that we may be forgetting. So this evening, I will give some attention to the ways in which the activities of Dutch Mennonites contributed to the beginnings of transnationalism. But to begin, I will provide some context and say something about the worldly Dutch. This is, after all, the reason why many of you are missing the hockey game tonight. You want to know something about the worldly Dutch. So I'll get right to it. I want us to first consider Rembrandt's famous group portrait, The Syndics of the Drapers Guild. This work is found today in Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum. It features dignitaries of the Cloth Guild who supervise the manufacturing and trade of cloth in the Dutch Republic. The individuals on display were prominent cloth merchants whose task it was to provide quality control for the wool industry. Rembrandt's portrayal of this wealthy group includes members from the Catholic, Reformed, Remonstrant, and Mennonite traditions. Interestingly, the Mennonite merchant Volkert Jans, or Volkert Janssen, stands out most prominently, suggesting that he may have commissioned the painting, or he may have played a leading role among the dignitaries of this guild. Rembrandt's work is revealing in at least 2 additional ways. It highlights the extent to which the Dutch Republic was pluralistic and tolerant of various faith traditions, and it illustrates that Mennonites by this time were economically successful and were well on their way toward assimilating and becoming an integral part of Dutch society, a departure from days gone by when Anabaptists were at the margins of society and persecuted for their convictions. The persecution of Anabaptists in the Netherlands had been especially difficult, far worse than anywhere else in Europe. But that soon changed. Already in 1568, the 7 northernmost provinces of the Netherlands had initiated a rebellion against their Spanish rulers, leading the way eventually to independence and religious toleration. William of Orange, the governor of the city of Antwerp, had led the revolt against Spain. In 1572, he left the Roman Catholic Church, became a Calvinist, and then proceeded to advocate for the toleration and religious freedom of minority groups, including the Mennonites. Article 13 of the Union of Utrecht in 1579 established a constitution that further granted freedom of conscience to the inhabitants of the United Provinces. In practice, this meant that the Dutch Reformed Church, which gained a certain privileged position in the Dutch Republic, had to tolerate other religious persuasions, including Roman Catholicism, the Jewish community, and Anabaptism. Under these circumstances, Mennonites continued to experience some discrimination, often instigated by Orthodox Calvinists. Nevertheless, their situation improved remarkably, and they were able to integrate into the mainstream of Dutch society and could soon benefit from the so-called Dutch Golden Age. Many prospered. Not all, but many prospered economically. A sizable number counting among the Dutch elite, succeeding in the whale and herring fisheries, excelling in the businesses of weaving and textiles, thriving in agriculture, and even succeeding in shipbuilding and international trade. Such industrious activity spilled over into the domestic realm as the newly rich became patrons of the arts. Nina Schrader, writing in the Journal of Mennonite Studies, has observed that the wealthiest families purchased country estates where they had the opportunity to cultivate vast pleasure gardens and collect rare nature treasures, including exotic fruits and flowers. Families that owned such properties and plants often documented their enjoyment of nature by ensuring that their estates and gardens were depicted in the family portraits that they commissioned. So here we have Agnes Block and family sitting under their cultivated pineapple tree. Besides these various economic and domestic pursuits, Mennonites participated in the intellectual developments of the Dutch Republic. They consumed literature in massive quantities and became active contributors to various literary organizations and societies having to do with furthering knowledge in the sciences and humanities and supporting efforts toward the betterment of society. They established nationwide social societies and a school system for the improvement of the poor and the working classes. They founded national magazines for public debate and translated and published large numbers of foreign tracts and treatises in order to promote and popularize Enlightenment ideas. Some became involved in interfaith discussions, such as the distiller, innkeeper, printer, and linguist Jan Tunis, who also operated the famous tavern and dancing hall called the Minister Bruiloft, literally meaning Mennonite wedding, which initially referred to disorderly wedding festivities, but in popular parlance had come to mean deviant behavior. The adventures of Tunis do not stop with bartending. He had significant contacts with Muslims from Morocco and somehow managed to learn Arabic and then lecture in that language at the University of Leiden. The connection to Islam was carried on some years later by the translator Jan Hendricks Glazemacher and printer Jan Ruwerts. These publishing entrepreneurs were responsible for the first Dutch language version of the Quran to be printed in Holland. Along the way, they also produced in translation several of the writings of the famous Jewish philosopher and early Enlightenment thinker Baruch Spinoza for the Dutch readership. Mennonites have tended to ignore this history. Particularly in the North American context, collective memory has typically portrayed the true representatives of Anabaptism as simple agrarians, the quiet in the land, those who cultivated simplicity and humility and remained at some distance from the world. True Mennonites have been portrayed as being in the world, but not of the world. The trouble is, the Dutch do not fit this picture. They were predominantly urbanites, in the city and of the city, as Mary Sprunger has put it. Piet Visser reminds us that unlike their North American progeny, the Dutch ancestors held no sense of a distinct Mennonite ethnicity, since they lived among other Dutch folks, nor did they use languages that differed from the local language, a practice common among subsequent Mennonites with a tradition of migration. Of course, theologically, they were distinct from their religious neighbors in that they maintained adult baptism, pacifism, more or less, and the rejection of swearing oaths, while honesty, sobriety, and a strong work ethic still remained hallmarks of their identity. Nevertheless, by the mid-17th century, not all, but a significant number of Dutch Mennonites flirted with and promoted Enlightenment ideas and drank deeply from the wells of theological liberalism. Consequently, the scholarship in both Europe and North America has sometimes seen this era, this period of time, as a period of decline and a falling off from the early principles of the heroes of early 16th century Anabaptism. To be sure, congregational memberships were falling off during these times, and some congregations disappeared entirely. And yet, what is particularly noteworthy for our intents and purposes this evening is that when the Dutch got worldly, in this supposed period of decline, we see the origins of a transnational reality, the origins of a global imagination. Some of you might recognize Joe Springer from the Goshen Archives. He was a neighbor of ours for about 5 years on 7th Street in Goshen, Indiana. An important way in which the Dutch Mennonites contributed to transnationalism was through their publications, which I have already alluded to earlier. Piet Visser and Michael Driedger have been at the forefront in bringing to light the extraordinary riches of Mennonite publishing. In the 16th and 17th century Netherlands, there were about 80 to 90 printers and publishers of Mennonite origin. Eventually, Dutch Mennonite publishing exceeded all other countries in the quantity and quality of Mennonite-related printing, at least until the 20th century. The publications were often literary, artistic, scientific, and philosophical in expression. Many writings that found their way to press were also religious in nature, and these works contributed to a transnational consciousness. We can see this happening with the Mennonite martyrological tradition. When we think of this tradition, what may come to mind is Tieleman Jans van Bracht's Martyr's Mirror, that large tome depicting the stories of the Anabaptist martyrs and images, such as the iconic Dirk Willems, who rescues his pursuer who has fallen through the ice. But the Martyr's Mirror, in its final form, took more than 100 years to write. It began with Jan Hendricks van Schonerwoerd, who anonymously published The Sacrifice unto the Lord in 1562. So 100 years before the final edition of the Martyr's Mirror. Initially, this work was a palm-sized collection of letters and songs which you could hide in your coat pocket, which you needed to hide in case you were stopped by the authorities for questioning. This small, easily concealed martyr book only mentioned 100 martyrs, and these were only from the province of Friesland. It was a highly provincial, localized publication. The martyrs of the other Mennonite groups, such as the Flemish and the Waterlanders, were mostly excluded from this work, as were the Swiss martyrs, except for Michael Sadler. In the next decades, however, the Sacrifice unto the Lord went through numerous iterations. By 1595, it had undergone at least 30 different editions. Then in 1615, the Martyr book went through a monumental expansion when Hans de Ries edited and enlarged the volume with a new title, The History of the Martyrs or Genuine Witnesses of Jesus Christ. Now, there were 600 martyrs in the Martyr book from such faraway places as Switzerland, Germany, Austria, and Moravia. This new volume was based on research that went far beyond examining the local archives it involved the dispatching of information gatherers and field researchers with much effort and cost. An additional feature of this expanded martyr book was its ecumenical and inter-Mennonite flavor. De Ries achieved this when he reduced the factors that made one a true Anabaptist to two convictions: adult baptism, and nonviolence. This reduction of criteria justified the inclusion of Swiss Brethren and Hutterites, along with all the variations that one could find among the Dutch Mennonites at the time. The strategy proved to be more successful than earlier attempts at unity, which sought to do so based on clarifying positions on church discipline, the nature of the church, or Christological questions related to the incarnation. The clear aim of de Ries's project was to reject a sectarian, separatist, and provincial mindset, and to develop a martyrology that was nonpartisan and trans-regional in scope, and it proved to be a truly pan-Anabaptist achievement. In 1631, de Ries and his Waterlander companions produced a further expanded edition, and then in 1660, building on the work of de Ries, Tieleman Jans van Bracht produced his Bloody Theatre, or Martyr's Mirror of the Baptized-Minded or Defenseless Christians, a cumbersome title to be sure. This volume included an additional section regarding the persecution of Swiss Anabaptists in 1635. The second and final edition, published in 1685, now simply called the Martyr's Mirror, continued to update the Swiss story with several additional extracts from letters and edicts concerning the Swiss Brethren in the canton of Bern. It also included some 104 etchings by Jan Luyken depicting images of Anabaptists being tortured and dying for their convictions. And this is the martyr book that most of us have often referenced or may have referenced from time to time. It's the one that we are most acquainted with. This Martyr's Mirror was eventually translated from the Dutch language into German at the Ephrata Cloister in Pennsylvania and then reprinted in the Palatinate in South Germany. It was widely used among the Amish and among Mennonites in Switzerland and Alsace-Lorraine. An English edition first appeared at Lampeter Square, Pennsylvania in 1835, and soon English as well as German editions could be found throughout North America. The Dutch martyrological tradition thus became an important vehicle for the development of a transnational imagination. But other literature served this purpose as well. For example, at the end of the 16th and at the beginning of the 17th centuries, Dutch Mennonites wrote and adopted numerous confessions of faith, initially intended to heal the various divisions between the churches that had been in conflict. Some of these confessions, such as the Dordrecht Confession of 1632, were translated into German and English with the effect of promoting greater unity among Mennonites in Europe and North America. Initially, the Dordrecht formulation had only been a Flemish document, but by 1660, 14 Palatinate ministers had adopted it, and with its translation into German in 1664, its importance increased to become an official confession for Swiss and Palatinate Anabaptists. Eventually, it was reprinted 8 times in Dutch, 116 times in German, and 73 times in English. Other publications also fed into this evolving transnational consciousness. Menno Simons' Foundation book, for example, was published in Germany in 1775 and then later reprinted in Switzerland. And like the Dordrecht Confession, it too eventually found a place across the Atlantic in the New World. Irvin Horst has estimated that at least 7,000 copies of Menno's work were published in the first 175 years that Mennonites were in North America. Similarly, Leonard Klock's Compendium of 18 Prayers, which was initially published in 1625, was soon circulating widely among Anabaptist communities across Europe and North America. Likewise, the devotional writings of Peter Peters found a broad and influential reach within the Mennonite world. Peters became known for his devotional books, tracts, and sermons, which were intended to renew and revitalize Anabaptist spirituality and ethics. Peters' collected works, his opera, was published in 1651 and read by both Mennonites and non-Mennonites in the Netherlands, and then it also found favor among Anabaptists living in South Germany, Poland, and Prussia, Southern Russia, and North America. The Kleine Gemeinde, a breakaway group that had formed in Russia and later arrived in Manitoba, was especially fond of Peter Peters's devotional writings. Beyond these contributions to the spirituality of a growing Anabaptist family, the work of Jan Philipp Scabalier, particularly his Lusthof des Gemüts, played a critical role in the spiritual formation of Mennonites on an international scale. Initially, the Lusthof found resonance among Roman Catholics, Protestants, and Mennonites alike. Then in 1717, a High German translation of the Lusthof was produced, likely by Benedict Brechtbühl, a Swiss Anabaptist leader from the canton of Bern. The later German edition, known as die Wandelnde Seele, was used extensively by the Kleine Gemeinde, and when Brechtbühl embarked on a new life in the British colony of Pennsylvania, Scabalier's writing entered the North American scene. The 13th edition of the English version, The Wandering Soul, was read widely and continues to be available for an Old Order Mennonite and Amish readership. Through these various publications, the worldly Dutch managed to cultivate a sense of common identity among European and North American Mennonites. Of course, this identity was not uniform, and there is truth to James Youngke's observation that the Swiss South German and Dutch Russian traditions were different from each other, with definably different historical memories, cultural characteristics, and theological preferences. Nevertheless, as a result of the book production of the worldly Dutch, Anabaptists in Europe and North America soon came to read one inclusive martyr book. They adopted similar confessional writings. They were shaped by the same devotional literature, all of which led to a growing awareness of one another. This growing transnational awareness was strengthened further when the Dutch Mennonites became involved in relief efforts directed at the Swiss relatives to the south, who continued to experience desperate times. Although in 1614 Hans Landis was the last Anabaptist martyr to be executed in Switzerland, the Swiss and South German Anabaptists continued to experience various forms of repression, particularly in Alsatian, Palatinate, and Bernese territories, often leading to unspeakable hardships. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, they faced imprisonment, torture, deportation, confiscation of property, the occupation of foreign armies, the destruction of their homes, and some were shackled in irons and sent to work on boats as galley slaves. Many died because of torture or abysmal prison conditions. In response, Dutch Mennonites responded with aid flowing southward beginning sometime in the 1640s. Through their Committee for Foreign Needs, Dutch Mennonites sent material aid and provided logistical support for refugees that were heading northward to the Netherlands. Some of the Dutch aid also managed to reach other geographical regions. For example, in 1660, it reached the Mennonites in Danzig, and 2 years later, it reached the Hutterites in Slovakia. Occasionally, aid was extended to the Waldenses in northern Italy, or to the Huguenots who had been expelled from France. In the first decades of the 18th century, in the 18th century, Vistula Delta Mennonites were suffering from the ravages of war, failed harvests, and a devastating plague, resulting in many casualties. Based on documents from the Lam and Toren congregation in Amsterdam, we know that the Dutch exchanged letters with their Prussian cousins and very likely sent aid to them as well. And of course, assistance was also provided to those who were crossing the Atlantic and settling in the New World. A further contribution of the Dutch Mennonites was their advocacy work in championing religious toleration. In 1609, with the publication of Religion's Freedom, and then again in 1619, with the publication of Chronicle of the Decline of Tyranny, the Frisian Mennonite elder Peter Jans Twisk had written extensively on the topic of toleration. The Chronicle was an impressive work of close to 2,000 pages in 2 volumes, and it was widely read by Mennonites and non-Mennonites alike. But more frequently, writings on religious toleration surfaced when the Dutch became increasingly aware that their co-religionists to the south were going through some of the most terrible and severe repressions. In their lobbying of officials in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, the Dutch Mennonites called on civic authorities to intervene on behalf of the persecuted Anabaptists. Sometimes they worked in collaboration with representatives of the Dutch Reformed Church. At other times, their lobbying efforts included communicating with the Reformed or civic authorities in the Swiss cantons. Although not always successful, these interventions led to an acceleration of inter-regional interactions among the various Anabaptist groups, thus shaping a growing transnational consciousness. Of all the advocates for toleration, one of the most persistent was the wealthy, worldly Amsterdam Mennonite merchant Hans Vlaming, who freighted ships in and out of various ports throughout Europe and was involved in lending large sums of money to other businesses. He also gave annually large sums of money to the poor, and at least on one occasion he journeyed to various cities collecting money to help out the persecuted Waldenses. From 1558 until 1671, Vlaming carried on an extensive letter-writing campaign. It appears that he corresponded with anyone who thought might be able to help press his case with the authorities in Switzerland. At the time, the campaign drew in prominent advocates of toleration, most notably the German poet and writer Philipp von Zessen, and there were many others that were also drawn in. Vlaming's arguments were multi-pronged. He noted that the Reformed and the Anabaptists held a number of beliefs in common and argued that Anabaptist distinctives were in no way subversive. The authorities were guilty of trying to compel consciences, which was not in accordance with the gospel, nor with the policies of those governing well. He pointed out the freedoms enjoyed by Dutch Mennonites, the history behind the emergence of this toleration, and the benefits it brought to society. Biblical arguments included appealing to the parable of the wheat and the tares from Matthew 13, and a quote from the Jewish elder Gamaliel from Acts 5 with a recognition that there was really no impartial judge that could settle differences in biblical interpretation. As Jeffrey Dipple has noted, Vlaming also moved beyond theological arguments, calling upon the words of William of Orange, who characterized the Dutch revolt against Spain as a war in support of freedom of conscience and not at all a war about establishing the primacy of the Reformed tradition. Rather than weakening the Dutch Republic, Vlaming argued that religious toleration actually made the state more secure. On the question regarding the value of welcoming refugees and the impact that foreigners might have on the economy, Vlaming compared cities that welcomed religious refugees with cities that closed their gates to refugees, and pointed out that the principles of freedom of conscience and religious toleration and the welcoming of strangers was actually beneficial to the economy. Such were the efforts of Hans Vlaming, who transcended geography, language, and culture to form a trans-regional and transnational bond among Mennonites. Interestingly, Flaming's work was taking shape exactly during a major Mennonite church conflict referred to infamously as the War of the Lambs, a conflict about the authority and function of the Mennonite confessions of faith. Yet it appears that Flaming and others could work together on relief efforts even if they did not see eye to eye on theological and church matters. Through a wide range of publications, through the dissemination of financial aid, letters of counsel, and through advocacy work in championing religious toleration, the Dutch could look past their differences and forge a network of relationships that led the way to an emerging transnational reality. Anniversaries and commemorations can be important moments of memory activation that can give communities an opportunity to reflect on the past and consider the future. In thinking about Anabaptism's 500 years, what are we remembering and what are we forgetting? In an age of growing nationalisms and guarded borders and fierce economic competition between nations, where should we look for inspiration? At a time of significant polarizations among Mennonite churches in the United States and Canada, are there stories that can inspire? Some years ago, as Mennonite World Conference was becoming increasingly aware that Anabaptism's center was shifting from north to south, the Faith and Life Council of MWC set out to outline the beliefs that Anabaptist communities around the world had in common. In 2006, after consulting 97 church bodies, a document called Shared Convictions of Global Anabaptists was adopted, an impressive work in its brevity, simplicity, and clarity. At the end of these shared convictions, we find a phrase that reads, "In these convictions, we draw inspiration from Anabaptist forebears of the 16th century." I very much agree with this statement, but I wonder whether it is too constrictive, too constraining, too narrow. Can we expand our horizons? Can we not insert a bit more imagination regarding where we look for inspiration? What about the worldly Dutch?
Well, thank you so much, Karl. And we have time for Q&A now. I think Jeremy and Aileen are both going to be going around with microphones. So if you have any questions, we got one already, just raise your hand and one of them will come over to you. And then Karl, you'll probably have to come back up here and face the masses.
My question is this. Did this movement towards worldliness and materialism, did it provoke controversy in the church? Was there a genuine debate? Were people in danger of being excommunicated over this change? Or was it something that happened naturally? Or was there conflict and debate about this, and based even on a theological position?
Yeah, so there certainly was debate in the 17th century. I mean, one of the reasons, there were actually a number of reasons that I can't go into, but several reasons why the martyrologies kept developing and evolving. And so Hans de Ries will say that he's trying to remind, I mean, among other things, he's trying to expand the Anabaptist world, and he's trying to demonstrate how it is much more expansive than previously thought. But he's also interested in reminding wealthy Mennonites, wealthy Doopsgezinde, that they come out of a heritage of people who were martyred for their faith, and now they're living in very good times. So what the devil could not do back in the 16th century, he was succeeding in doing in the 17th century with the wealth that was coming around. So there are examples of that. Peter Peters wrote an essay on greed, and so you've got writings in this time period, and it's also part of the broader literature that's also present in the Reformed churches as well. They're talking about the embarrassment of riches, right, in the Dutch Republic. And so it's an ongoing theme in the 17th and 18th centuries.
I appreciate your talk very much, but I'm curious. You said there were 2 million Anabaptists roughly, so my question is, why are there not 50 million or 100 million? Given the, I would say, attractive features of Anabaptism, particularly freedom of conscience and pacifism, and particularly given the wealth of Dutch Mennonites in the 17th century, and their, maybe not control, but certainly they had a lot of printing establishments. They were very active in the publishing field. Why did more people not join the Anabaptist movement?
That's a very good question. I mean, that's not something I was thinking about when I was putting this together. So I'm not going to say very much about that, I don't think. I mean, one thing to say, a couple of things to say maybe is that, first of all, there are lots of people who are sympathetic to Anabaptism. They're Anglicans, they're Roman Catholics, they're Lutherans, they're Reformed. And and they're happy with where they're at and are also happy to be influenced by Anabaptism in the same way that Mennonites are happy about being influenced by other traditions. So I think there's denominational moving back and forth, but the stakes are not as high as they used to be. So that's one thing. I mean, another thing I think is that when it comes to pacifism, that's a real troubling barrier for some people, for some groups. So it's a high price to pay, I think.
Thanks, Karl. Just to add to the question here, the Dutch Anabaptists were the first Mennonite group to send missionaries to Indonesia in 1850 and the others. And I want to get back to why can't we expand our reference point, just drawing on the first century Anabaptists. I'm going to conjecture that a Mennonite World Conference for a long time was dominated by North American Mennonites, where Swiss Mennonites formed the majority, the dominant ethos. And the Swiss always had struggles coming out of their very pietistic orientation with the more liberal, worldly Anabaptists of the Netherlands. And so the ethos of Mennonite World Conference and its reference points, they draw more on a Swiss-Russian Mennonite connection than draw on or refer to the Dutch Mennonites.
Yeah, I wouldn't dispute that at all. I mean, I think I know who some of the writers were in this that makes sense. They should have known better, but anyway. They're nice people.
Thank you very much for your research and your presentation. In the 17th, and I don't know much about the 17th and 18th century Dutch in terms of conflict, wars and so on. But the question I want to ask is, can you say something about Dutch Anabaptists and war during that period? In other parts of the world where Anabaptists / Mennonites went, they often seem to get exemptions from military service, in part because they were living by themselves and so on.
Yeah.
In the Dutch, as I'm listening to you, related to the Dutch Anabaptists, there wasn't much of a separation between church and state. These people were well integrated within their culture. So what I'm wondering about is, do we have any knowledge of, say, resistance of Dutch Anabaptists to the Dutch war effort during that period?
Yeah. So there is a lot of war going on. I mean, the War of Independence is something like, it's the 80-year war, and then there's the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. Now in the Netherlands, they're escaping a lot of that, but there's a lot of war going on in Europe. I mean, it's a terrible century. The 17th century is absolutely catastrophic when it comes to wars. And I did talk a little bit about, the Swiss being affected, and the Vistula Delta and Danzig Mennonites being affected by ravages of war and all that sort of thing. The Mennonites are working out deals with the monarchy, just like they did this for many centuries, and they ended up doing that also in Russia, right? Getting privileges. And they were also getting exemptions from William of Orange in 1570, well, around 1572, around there. So they would have paid a tax of some kind. So the Dutch are doing this. What happens, we know a number of us that have connections with the Russian Mennonite story know about Catherine and Mennonite privileges, or we know something about that. But really, it has a long history in the Low Countries. The Prussian Mennonites were doing this for hundreds of years, and all the way back to the 16th century, the Dutch are doing it almost immediately with William of Orange. So there's a lot of that negotiating going on. But they don't always, I mentioned, I don't know if you noticed, but I said they held on to pacifism most of the time. I mean, the question is, do we put cannons on our ships? Because when we take our ships into the Atlantic and think about going down around the Cape of Good Hope, is that to the Indies? Should we put cannons on our ships, or are we going to have a police escort, or what are we going to do? Or what about up in the Baltic area? What about pirates up there? How are we going to protect ourselves? So there's the whole question around policing and protection is very much front and center for business people and entrepreneurs, and there's conversation going on in communities, in religious communities about this and what it means to be a pacifist. I mean, in Altona, which is not exactly the Netherlands, Hamburg, Altona, North Germany, I'm talking about, there was a Rosen family that was producing gunpowder. So whether they were actually using it or whether they were just selling it is a question of some debate. I'm not quite sure, or it's something I'm not clear about. So it's a live topic.
So Karl, our online community would like you to expand a bit more on the Dutch Mennonite experience with imperialism, you mentioned the Indies, colonization. What kind of effect did that have on this global Anabaptist imagination?
Yes, that portrait up there of that family, is it Agnes Bloch family? A lot of that was inspired by a lot of the art. Well, I think that art was inspired by by Italy, but I think it was also inspired by the East Indies. We know that there were Mennonite names associated with the Mennonite slave trade. So there was just an article that came out in the Doopsgezinde Bijdragen about 2 or 3 years ago, and MQR translated that into English about a year or two ago. So we're learning things about Anabaptist involvement in colonialism. And of course, there was conflict also. Somebody mentioned something about the missionary movement in Indonesia. And right at the get-go, you've got a conversation going on in Indonesia whether the Dutch missionaries are pushing a kind of a colonial agenda, or whether they're allowing the locals to take charge of their own destiny. So these are things that are very much front and center, and scholars are just beginning to unearth some of that material having to do with colonialism.
More questions? Oh, well, Ben wants to ask a question, but I want to ask a question before Ben asks a question. So this is my question. Karl, is this unidirectional in terms of the contribution to a transnational identity, which meaning are the Dutch interested in what other people have to contribute to this conversation, or is it just about them?
Oh, yes. Yeah, so I wasn't very nuanced in some of what I was talking about. The correspondences between the Dutch and the Swiss went in two directions. And so, yeah, there is conversation going back and forth, and there's obviously influences happening from the south to the north. The Swiss are influencing the north, to be sure. And then they're having correspondences with the North Americans in Pennsylvania, in Germantown, and you get Quaker influence, and you get North American Mennonites talking. So it's a back and forth. So I think John Roth has talked a little bit about the influence going in two directions. That's not something I talked about very much, or at all really this evening, but it was there, yeah.
I think my colleague beat me to my half-formed question, which is probably not quite as eloquent, but I was also thinking about the communication around the Committee for Foreign Needs. You kind of suggested that perhaps Dutch Anabaptists were considering themselves to be, too successful, right? This embarrassment of riches they had, and that they needed to they had a responsibility to do to give assistance to suffering Anabaptists in other parts of the world. Did that logic play out in any of those records? If we think about some of my students were reading letters that Glenn Penner had helped translate from Vistula Delta Mennonites, but we didn't get to see the other side of that discussion, maybe debates that were happening, attempts to raise funds among Doopsgezinde. So was that logic there? Oh, we need to help these people because we are so distant from our own suffering.
That's a very good question, and I don't have an answer to that question. Part of it I think would be tradition would have played a role in this. There's a kind of momentum from the 16th century that we need to take care of each other. What I find interesting about the Dutch is that they're actually taking care of others as well. They're not just taking care of their own people, right? So you get Hans Vlaming raising money for Waldenses and Huguenots and so on. The motivation, is it tradition? It's part of what it means to be Christian. The Reformed are aware of this. They're Mennonites are not the only ones that are thinking about this, so it's part of Christian tradition. It's a very good question. I don't have an easy or a quick answer to it.
One of the things that shows up in the literature is a relationship between the merchants in Danzig and the merchants in Amsterdam. And what happened in 1772 was the first partition of Poland, where Frederick the Great decided to take Royal Prussia, and Austria took some land, and Russia took some land. And so when they got Royal Prussia, when the Prussians got Royal Prussia, they named it West Prussia, and they didn't have Danzig, and they didn't have Thorn. So in Danzig, what they did was they imposed tariffs, which is really topical today. And so from 1772 till 1793, when they got Danzig, there were tariffs. And what happened was that the trade, let's say in last in wheat, went from 50,000 last per annum out of Danzig, and a lot of that was headed to Amsterdam. It dropped to 10,000 last, so a significant decrease from the tariffs. And then when the tariffs got lifted, it went back up to 25,000 last. So there was definitely an effect of the tariffs. The interesting thing to me was not only the decrease and the change in the quantity, but the change in the market. So what happens is initially they're exporting wheat from Danzig to Amsterdam, and at the end of the period, there's almost no wheat going from Danzig to Amsterdam. It's almost all going to England. So I was wondering why the date of the 3 volumes goes to 1784. Like, when was the golden age?
Yeah, I don't, the documents of brotherly love, the 3 volumes, that's what you're referring to. I have no idea why that ends at that date. And I wrote a book review for some journal. I don't know if it was JMS or whether it was MQR, and I didn't raise that question, but it was on my mind the whole time, and I don't know what it was. I mean, I think the situation in Switzerland might have been getting better, but there were other things happening. So I can't answer that question. And I really appreciate your comments about the tariffs and what's going on there. That's something I didn't know very much about. So very interesting. Thanks for that.
Question, sorry. Are there any aspects of the Dutch story that serve as a warning for us not to follow?
Well, that's true of any age. So 16th century Anabaptism, there's lots of warning there about that age, and there's warnings about the 17th and 18th centuries, to be sure. So what I did purposefully this evening was highlight the positive, because I'm making an argument, right? I'm making a point that North Americans have generally seen 17th and 18th century Dutch as uninteresting, worldly people. They can't teach us anything. So let's just ignore that history altogether. So I'm sure I could dig up a lot of dirt. Colonialism would be an example of that, right? We could focus on that and find some problems. We could find problems with the kind of wealth that kind of went over the top and wasn't being used in constructive ways. I'm sure that would be easy to do. The assimilation of the Dutch. I'm not suggesting that they were perfect people, or that, just simply making a counter argument to what I think we've often heard for decades, for centuries actually, that the Dutch are a problem. And I'm suggesting that maybe we should take a second look at that history. And maybe there is something where did MCC get its idea of helping out, with foreign aid? Well, this history has been there for a very, very long time. So, so if we just look at the Dutch, we can suddenly see a tradition that's really quite compelling. That's what I was simply trying to say this evening.
Karl, thanks very much for that presentation. There seems to be sort of an irony here, is that these folks with that sort of life-giving global imagination are rooted in the Netherlands, when in fact there's a diaspora going on with the Dutch moving to West Prussia, and those folks who, I guess that's more or less the ancestry of most Mennonites in Manitoba, at this time, in fact, don't have a global imagination. So it's the diasporic people that are more locally oriented, and it's the Dutch, the folks rooted in the Netherlands, that have more of a global imagination, which seems almost contradictory in a way. I'm wondering whether, to what extent, concurrent with that global imagination is a nationalist imagination, or a nascent nationalism, or a nationalism that's beginning to rise, and whether there is an irony there that if you are rooted in a nation, in a way, where wealth and cultural richness can sort of grow, it affords you the luxury, possibly, or the cosmopolitan outlook for a global imagination.
Yeah, so the Dutch, achieved this global imagination, or are thinking globally. I mean, it's not accidental that they're living in the Netherlands, which is a nation that is thinking globally, right? So why wouldn't Mennonites living in that country also think globally? So that's not accidental. It's kind of like, well, of course, it's obvious, right? It's nothing exceptional. Although I think reaching out internationally was significant, nevertheless, on their part, in the ways in which people like Hans Vlaming, carried out his concerns for other people. I mean, what you raise for me is another question about the term transnational. And I'm actually, maybe this isn't the place to, maybe we need to go out to Saffron's and discuss this. But why the term transnational? Why the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies? So I chose to use that term, but I'm wondering whether so in this context, transregional, I think Astrid von Schlachter uses überregional or something is the German word. So she uses that word to talk about this expanding imagination. And of course the title is global. I used the word global imagination, but I'm wondering whether transnational is limiting. Like, do you folks want to maybe rethink your Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies? Is that the best term? I think it's very helpful. It comes out in the literature. There are probably many good reasons for using the. If I was sitting around the table, you never asked me, but I would have said, yeah, let's go with transnational. But I wonder whether there's other language that better encapsulates what's going on. I think there's something limiting about the word transnational, because it focuses on nations. But that's not really what I wanted to talk about this evening, and I don't think it was really more of a überregional, it was a trans-regional interest that that just, wasn't thinking about boundaries and nation states at all.
Well, with that provocative critique of the mandate of our research center, I think it's time to conclude our. We're going to get the hook out here, yeah.
I've already been invited, so I could say now whatever I want.
If there's no further questions, though, we're going to end there and say thank you again, Karl, for the wonderful talk. And we'll hash out this transnational debate through those doors over there while we have coffee and sweets. Fear not, I switched recently to decaf coffee, so you're all going to have to suffer with me and sleep well tonight. The coffee in there has no caffeine in it. And continue on and have a discussion with folks in the room. And thank you so much for coming out. We've got a few more events coming up. A May film night, I believe it's May 21st. Film by Stephanie Stobie about the Southeast Asian refugee crisis, including the work of Mennonite Central Committee in supporting the private sponsorship of refugee bills. So another great documentary film to draw your attention. And let's proceed onwards. Thanks.